I didn't realize how quiet the world could get until the moment he locked the door behind me and left me in the dark with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the soft, uneven rhythm of my baby moving inside me. 7 months pregnant and sitting on a thin layer of straw that smelled like rain and old wood, my fingers trembling as I wrapped my arms around my stomach, trying to keep the cold from reaching him. Because it wasn't me I was worried about anymore. It was him, always him. And I remember thinking that this couldn't be my life, that this couldn't be the same man who once held my hand like I was something fragile and precious. Because Jason used to smile at me like I was his entire world, back when we lived in a small apartment that barely fit a couch and a kitchen table, but somehow felt bigger than this house ever did. Back when he would bring me coffee in the mornings and kiss my forehead like it meant something. But somewhere between the missed paychecks and the late nights and the silence that grew heavier every day, something shifted, something I couldn't name at first, something that turned warmth into distance and distance into something colder, something that made him look at me like I was a problem he didn't know how to solve. And tonight it had been something small, something stupid, a plate slipping from my hands and shattering against the tile floor, the sound sharp enough to make my heart jump. And I froze because I knew what came next, not loud, not dramatic, just that quiet tension in the air that always came before he made a decision. And he didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice, just looked at the mess and then at me and said I needed to learn. And before I could understand what he meant, I was outside. The door closing behind me with a sound that felt final, the cold hitting me all at once, the kind that seeps into your bones slowly, like it has all the time in the world. And I knocked it first, softly, then harder, calling his name, trying to remind him of who I was, who we used to be, but nothing came back except silence, and eventually even I stopped making noise because it felt pointless. So I sat there, pulling my coat tighter around me, whispering to my baby that we were okay, even though I wasn't sure that was true, counting seconds just to feel like time was still moving. And I don't know how long I was there before I heard it, the low hum of an engine cutting through the stillness, tires crunching slowly over gravel like whoever was arriving didn't feel the need to rush. And something about that sound made my chest tighten in a different way. Not fear exactly, but awareness, like the night itself had shifted, and I could hear voices now, Jason's included, but it sounded different, strained, careful, like he was choosing his words more than usual. And I turned my head toward the small gap in the wooden slats, pressing my eye against it just enough to see the driveway, just enough to catch the shape of a black SUV sitting under the porch light, its surface reflecting the glow like glass. And then the door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, composed, dressed in a way that made everything around him feel smaller, like the air itself adjusted to his presence. And he didn't move fast, didn't need to, just walked forward with a kind of quiet certainty that made it impossible to look away. And I remember holding my breath without realizing it, watching as his gaze moved once across the yard, across the house, and then stopped, directly on the shed, directly on me. Even though I knew he couldn't fully see me, and yet somehow it felt like he did, like he understood something in a single glance that I had been living for months without words. And in that moment, sitting in the cold with my hands wrapped around my stomach, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it, like the world had just tilted slightly in a direction I didn't expect, and I didn't know who he was or why he was here. But the way Jason's voice faltered when he spoke to him told me one thing clearly. Something had just changed, and whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be the same anymore. Jason tried to laugh, but it came out thinner than I had ever heard before, like something fragile stretched too tight. And I could not see his face clearly from where I sat, but I could hear it in his voice, that careful tone he only used when he felt outmatched. And the man in the driveway did not respond right away. He just stood there for a second that felt longer than it should have, letting the silence settle like weight. And then he spoke, his voice low and steady, not loud but impossible to ignore, asking a simple question that somehow carried more meaning than anything else that had been said that night. What is she doing out there? And I felt my breath catch because he had not asked if someone was out there. He had asked about me, like he already knew, like he had already seen enough. And Jason answered too quickly, saying it was nothing, saying I just needed space, saying things that sounded small and harmless when you said them fast enough. But even from inside the shed I could tell they did not land the way he wanted them to. because the air shifted again, quieter, heavier, and then there were footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer across the gravel, each one measured, each one controlled, and I pressed my hand against the wooden wall beside me, as if that could somehow steady me, as if I could disappear into it if I needed to, but I did not look away. I could not when everything inside me was telling me that this moment mattered, that whatever happened next would not just pass like everything else had. And the footsteps stopped just outside the shed, so close I could hear the faint sound of fabric moving when he shifted his weight. And for a second there was nothing, no words, no movement, just the quiet hum of the night and the soft sound of my own breathing. And then his voice again, closer now, clearer, saying open it. Not a demand shouted across a room, not anger, just certainty, like the outcome had already been decided, and he was simply stating the next step. And Jason hesitated. I could hear it in the silence that followed, in the way he did not answer right away, in the way the moment stretched just enough to reveal something I had not seen before, uncertainty, and it was such a small thing, but it felt enormous, because Jason was never uncertain, not in this house, not with me. And yet now he was, and when he finally spoke his voice had changed, less confident, more defensive, saying it was not necessary, saying I would come inside when I learned my lesson, saying things that suddenly sounded weaker than they ever had before, and the man did not argue, did not raise his voice. He just took one more step closer and repeated himself, open it. And something about the way he said it made everything else fade, like there were no other options left in the world except the one he had just given. And a few seconds later I heard the latch, the metal shifting, the small click that sounded louder than anything else that night, and the door creaked open just enough for light to spill inside, cutting through the darkness in a thin line that made me blink, and I did not move at first. I just sat there frozen, my eyes adjusting, my heart racing in a way that felt different from fear, because it was not just about what might happen to me anymore. It was about what was changing around me, what was shifting in ways I could not control or fully understand. And then I saw him, really saw him for the first time, standing just outside the doorway, his silhouette framed by the porch light, his expression unreadable, but his eyes focused entirely on me, not scanning, not assessing, just fixed, like I was the only thing that mattered in that moment. And it was strange, because he did not look shocked or angry or even surprised. He looked certain, like what he was seeing confirmed something he had already decided. And without saying anything, he reached up and removed his coat. A simple movement, calm, deliberate, and then he stepped forward just enough to place it around my shoulders, the fabric warm and heavy against my skin, carrying a faint scent I could not place, but that felt clean, steady, real. And I realized then how cold I had been because the warmth hit me all at once, making my hands shake even more. And he did not rush me, did not pull me up, just waited, his hand still extended slightly, as if offering rather than taking. And I hesitated, not because I did not want to move, but because I was not used to being given a choice anymore. Not like this, not in a way that felt genuine. And when I finally placed my hand in his, it felt different from anything I had felt in a long time. Not tight, not controlling, just steady, like something that would not break if I leaned on it. And as he helped me stand, I caught a glimpse of Jason in the background, his posture rigid, his expression tight, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw something in his eyes that had never been there before. Not anger, not control, but the quiet realization that whatever hold he thought he had was slipping. And I did not understand who this man was or why he had come. But as I stood there wrapped in his coat with my hand still in his, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was not invisible anymore the moment my feet touched the ground outside the shed. The night felt different, like the air itself had shifted into something I did not recognize anymore. And I realized I was still holding on to his hand longer than necessary, not because I could not stand on my own, but because for the first time in months I did not feel like I was about to fall. And he did not pull away either. He simply adjusted his grip slightly, steady, respectful, like he understood exactly how much pressure to use and no more. And when I finally let go, it was not because I had to, it was because I chose to. And that thought alone made something in my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, and I wrapped the coat closer around my shoulders, the warmth settling deeper now, reaching places the cold had been sitting for too long. And he stepped back just enough to look at me fully, his eyes moving once, quickly, taking in everything without lingering on anything that would make me feel exposed. And then he turned, not toward me, but toward Jason, and the shift was immediate. Like watching someone close a door behind them and become something else entirely, not louder, not harsher, just more defined, more precise. And Jason tried to recover. I could hear it in the way he cleared his throat, in the way he straightened his posture like that would somehow give him back control, saying my name like a reminder, like a claim, telling me to come inside because this had gone far enough. But it sounded wrong now, like words that no longer fit the situation, and the man beside me did not raise his voice, did not interrupt. He just waited until Jason finished, and then asked a question so simple it cut through everything else. Do you think this is acceptable? And there was no accusation in it, no anger, just clarity, like he was offering Jason a chance to hear himself. And for a second Jason said nothing. And in that silence I saw something I had never seen before, hesitation that was not hidden, uncertainty that could not be covered by louder words. And when he finally responded, it was defensive, explaining, minimizing, saying I needed discipline, saying it was temporary, saying things that suddenly sounded smaller with every word. And I felt something inside me shift as I listened, not because I had not heard these words before, but because this time they were being heard by someone else, someone who did not accept them as normal. And the man beside me tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in evaluation, like he was measuring the distance between what was said and what was true. And then he nodded once, almost to himself, as if he had reached a conclusion. And the quiet that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Because it was not empty, it was full of decision, and he stepped forward just one pace, closing the space between them without urgency, without threat, just presence. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer than I expected, but it carried something undeniable, something final, saying she is not staying here tonight. And Jason reacted immediately, stepping forward, shaking his head, insisting that this was his house, his family, his situation to handle. And for a brief second I felt that familiar pull, that instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make things easier. But it did not take hold the way it used to, because I was not standing there alone anymore, and the man beside me did not argue, did not debate. He simply looked at Jason with a calm that felt unmovable and said, that is no longer your decision. And it was not the words themselves, it was the certainty behind them, the way they left no space for negotiation. And something in Jason's expression changed again, sharper this time, frustrated, like he was pushing against something he could not move. And I watched it happen, watched the moment control slip just enough to be noticed, and I realized I was breathing differently now, deeper, steadier, like my body was catching up to something my mind had not fully processed yet. And the man turned back to me then, his expression softening just slightly, enough to signal that whatever this was, it was not directed at me. And he gestured toward the vehicle waiting at the end of the driveway, the door already open, as if this had been planned before anyone spoke a word. And he said, you are coming with me. And there was no pressure in it, no force, just an invitation wrapped in certainty. And I hesitated for only a second, not because I doubted him, but because I was leaving behind something I had once believed was permanent, something I had built my life around. And even broken things can feel heavy when you walk away from them. But then I looked down at my hands, still shaking slightly, still cold despite the coat, and I felt the small movement inside me, a reminder of why I could not stay, why I should not stay. And when I lifted my eyes again, meeting his, I nodded, just once, and that was enough, because he did not ask anything else, did not question my choice. He simply turned and walked with me toward the car, matching his pace to mine, without saying a word. And behind us I could feel Jason watching, feel the weight of his presence without turning back. And for the first time in a long time, I did not need to look to know what was happening. I only needed to keep moving forward. The door of the SUV closed with a soft, controlled sound that felt nothing like the sharp slam I was used to. And for a second I just sat there, my hands resting on my stomach, my fingers still trembling as I tried to understand what had just happened, because everything had moved so quickly, and yet each moment felt stretched, deliberate, like it had been decided long before I was even aware of it. And the warmth inside the car wrapped around me in a way that made my eyes sting, not from pain, but from the sudden contrast, The way comfort can feel almost overwhelming when you have been without it for too long. And I pulled the coat tighter around my shoulders, breathing in slowly, trying to steady myself. While the man slid into the seat beside me without a word, his movements calm, precise. Like nothing about this situation had surprised him, and the driver in the front did not turn, did not ask questions. He simply started the engine as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. And as the car began to move, I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because it was real now. I was leaving, not just stepping outside for a moment, not waiting for the door to open again, but leaving in a way that felt final. And I did not look back, not because I was strong, but because I was afraid that if I did, I might hesitate. And I could not afford to hesitate anymore, not with a life depending on me. And the silence inside the car was not uncomfortable. It was steady, intentional, like it was giving me space rather than taking something away. And after a few minutes he spoke, his voice softer now, without the edge it carried before, asking if I was cold. And it was such a simple question that it caught me off guard, because it had been so long since anyone had asked me. Something without an expectation attached to it. And I shook my head slightly, even though my hands still felt chilled, because the warmth of the coat and the car had already begun to settle into me. And he nodded once, accepting the answer without pressing further. And then he asked another question, just as simple, "Are you hurt?" And I hesitated, not because I did not understand, but because I was not used to answering honestly, not used to being asked in a way that meant the answer mattered. And I glanced down at my hands, at the faint redness from the cold, at the way they still would not stay completely still, and I said no, my voice quiet, but steady enough. And he studied me for a moment, not doubting, not challenging, just observing, as if he was making sure my words matched what he could see. And then he leaned back slightly, giving me space again. And for a while neither of us spoke, the only sound the low hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the road beneath us. And I found myself watching the city lights as they began to appear in the distance, each one small but steady, like markers guiding us somewhere I could not yet see. And my mind started to catch up with everything that had happened, replaying the moment the door opened, the way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken to Jason, the certainty in his voice. And I realized I did not even know his name, did not know why he had come, did not know what this meant beyond the fact that I was no longer sitting in that shed. And the thought both comforted and unsettled me, because leaving something behind is one thing, but not knowing what you are stepping into is another. And as if he could sense that shift in me, he spoke again, this time more directly, saying my name, Emily. And I turned slightly, surprised, because I had not told him, not that I remembered. And he noticed the reaction, a faint change in his expression that suggested he understood the question forming before I could ask it. And he said, "You do not need to worry about how I know. Not tonight." And there was something about the way he said it that made me believe him, not because it answered anything, but because it did not feel like a threat. It felt like reassurance, like he was removing something from my shoulders rather than placing more weight on them. And I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath again without noticing. And then he added one more thing, his voice quiet but firm, "You are safe now." And the words settled into me differently than anything else had, because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just simple and certain. And I wanted to believe them, more than I had wanted to believe anything in a long time. And as the car turned onto a wider road, the city opening up ahead of us, I rested my hand gently over my stomach, feeling the small movement beneath my palm. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to think that maybe, just maybe, things were not only changing, they were about to begin again. The city lights grew brighter as we moved deeper into streets I did not recognize, tall buildings replacing quiet houses. The world outside shifting from darkness into something alive and awake even at this hour. And I found myself watching everything with a kind of cautious curiosity, like I had stepped into a life that did not belong to me. Not yet. And the car slowed as it turned into a wide driveway lined with soft lights that stretched like a path guiding us forward. And I felt my breath catch slightly as the vehicle came to a smooth stop in front of a building that did not just look expensive. It looked intentional. Every line clean, every detail precise, like nothing here was accidental. And for a moment I did not move, my hand still resting over my stomach, my mind trying to catch up again, because it was one thing to leave, It was another to arrive somewhere completely unknown, and before I could decide what to do, the door beside me opened, not abruptly, not rushed, just quietly, and he stepped out first, turning slightly as if to give me space rather than pulling me along, and I realized again how different that felt, how every action so far had been offered instead of forced, and I took a breath before shifting forward, placing my feet on solid ground, the surface smooth beneath my shoes, the air warmer here, calmer, like even the environment had been designed to remove discomfort. And when I stood fully upright, I felt the coat slip slightly from my shoulders, and without thinking he adjusted it gently, the movement brief but careful, making sure it stayed wrapped around me without holding me in place. And then he gestured toward the entrance, not commanding, simply indicating, and I followed, my steps slower than his, but matched without him needing to look back, like he was aware of my pace without needing to check. And as we moved inside, the difference was immediate, the quiet deeper, the air carrying a faint scent of something clean and subtle, and I became aware of people in the background, not close, not intrusive, just present, watching without staring, acknowledging without questioning. And it made me realize that this was not just a house. It was something structured, something organized around him in a way I did not yet understand. And we stopped near what felt like the center of it all, a space open enough to breathe in but controlled enough to feel contained. And I hesitated there, suddenly aware of myself again, of the way I must look, the way I had been sitting in the cold not long ago. And that familiar instinct returned for a second, the urge to shrink, to apologize, but it did not take hold the same way it used to, because he turned to me before it could settle, his expression steady, not judging, not questioning, just present. And he said, "You can rest here tonight," his voice calm, like this had already been decided in a way that did not require permission. And I nodded slowly, not because I fully understood, but because I felt. Something in me began to trust the consistency of his actions. And then he added one more thing, softer this time, saying, "No one here will disturb you." And the words landed differently than before, not just as reassurance, but as a boundary set in place for me, something I did not have to fight to maintain. And I realized how unfamiliar that felt, how strange it was to be given space without having to ask for it. And a woman approached then, her presence quiet but confident, her expression warm, without being intrusive, and she spoke gently, offering to show me to a room. And I glanced at him briefly, not asking for permission but acknowledging the connection that had brought me here. And he gave a small nod, enough to let me know I could go without hesitation. And as I followed her down a hallway that seemed to stretch longer than I expected, I felt the weight of everything begin to settle into something real, something I could not ignore or push away. And when the door to the room opened, I stopped for a second, taking in the space, the bed, the soft lighting, the quiet that felt safe rather than empty. And I stepped inside slowly, my hand still resting over my stomach, feeling the steady presence beneath it. And when the door closed behind me, gently, without sound, I stood there in the middle of the room, not moving, just breathing. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing demanding my attention, nothing forcing me to react, nothing waiting for me to make a mistake. And I realized that I did not know what to do with that kind of silence. Not yet. But as I sat down on the edge of the bed, pulling the coat tighter around me, I allowed myself to close my eyes. For just a second, and in that moment, the only thought that stayed with me was not fear, not confusion, but a quiet, unfamiliar question. What kind of man changes everything without raising his voice? Sleep did not come easily, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because it was too comfortable, too soft beneath me, too quiet around me. And my body did not know how to accept that without question. Every small sound making my eyes open again as if I expected something to follow, something to demand my attention, but nothing ever did. And eventually, I found myself staring at the ceiling, one hand resting over my stomach, feeling the slow, steady movement beneath my palm, grounding myself in something real, something that had not changed no matter where I was. And I whispered softly, not even realizing I was doing it, telling my baby that we were safe, testing the words more than believing them, because safety was something I had learned not to trust too quickly. And yet here I was, in a room that felt untouched by everything I had just left behind, and I did not know what to do with that. And at some point I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again the light had shifted, soft morning filtering through the curtains, warm and steady, and for a second I did not move, just lay there, letting the quiet settle around me, waiting for something to break it, but nothing did. And the realization came slowly, not all at once, that no one was going to wake me with sharp words or impatient expectations. No one was waiting for me to get something wrong, and I sat up carefully, my body still adjusting, still cautious, and the coat was still around my shoulders, heavier now with meaning than just warmth, and I held it there for a moment before finally setting it aside, my fingers lingering on the fabric as if letting go of it too quickly might pull me back into something I had just escaped, and a soft knock at the door made me freeze for a second, instinctively holding my breath, but it was followed by a gentle voice asking if I was awake, and there was no urgency in it, no pressure, just a question, and I answered quietly, yes, and the door opened just enough for the same woman from the night before to step in, her expression calm, kind in a way that did not feel forced, and she asked if I needed anything, food, water, anything at all, and I realized I had not even thought about that, not since everything happened, and my body responded before my mind did, a small nod, and she smiled slightly, not overly warm, just enough to let me know I was being seen, and said she would bring something up, and when she left the room, returned to silence again, but this time it felt different, less unfamiliar, more like something I could sit with without tension building in my chest, and I stood slowly, moving toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see outside, the city stretching out in front of me, alive and distant at the same time, and I wondered how far I was from the life I had left, not in miles, but in something harder to measure, something that felt like distance but was really something else, something internal. And as I stood there I heard the door open again, quieter this time, and I turned, expecting the woman, but it was him instead, standing just inside the doorway, not stepping further in until I acknowledged him, like he understood the boundary without needing to be told, and for a second neither of us spoke, just a brief pause where everything settled into place, and then he asked how I was feeling, his voice the same as before, calm, steady, and I searched for the right answer, not the easy one, not the automatic one, but something honest, and I said I am not sure, and it felt strange to admit that out loud, but he did not react. Like it was a problem, he simply nodded once, accepting it as enough, and then he stepped a little closer, still leaving space between us, and said that was expected, that nothing about what had happened was simple, and there was no rush to understand it all at once, and I felt something loosen in my chest at that, something small but real, because I was not being asked to explain myself, not being pushed to feel a certain way. And then he added something else, his tone slightly firmer now, saying that no one would be coming here to take me back, that whatever I had left behind would stay behind unless I chose otherwise, and the words settled into me slowly, heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they were not just reassurance, they were a line drawn clearly, and I realized I had been waiting for that without knowing it, waiting to hear that I would not be pulled back into something I had not been able to leave on my own, and I nodded again, this time more certain, and for a moment I just looked at him, really looked, trying to understand what kind of person does this, what kind of person steps into a situation that is not theirs and changes it without hesitation, without explanation, and before I could stop myself, I asked the question that had been building since the night before, "Who are you?" And he did not answer right away, not because he was avoiding it, but because he seemed to consider how to say it in a way that mattered, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. He said his name was Adrian, and that was all, no titles, no explanations, just a name, and somehow that felt more significant than anything else he could have said, because it meant I would have to learn the rest on my own, piece by piece. Just like everything else that was changing around me, his name stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it was unusual, but because of the way he said it. Simple, direct, like it carried weight without needing anything added to it. Adrian. And I repeated it quietly in my mind as he stood there, watching me in that steady way that never felt intrusive, just present, and I realized I did not feel the need to look away, not like I used to when someone held my gaze too long. And that alone felt like something shifting inside me, something small but important, and he seemed to notice, not the thought itself but the change in my posture, the way I held myself just a little differently, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging progress without calling attention to it. and then he stepped back toward the door, not turning his back fully until I had relaxed again. Like he understood that even small movements could feel significant right now. And before leaving, he said there would be a doctor coming later to check on me, just to make sure everything was fine. And the words made me tense for a second, not because I did not want care, but because I was not used to it being offered without conditions. And he must have seen that reaction, because he added quietly that it was only if I was comfortable. Nothing would be done without my agreement, and that distinction mattered more than I expected, and I nodded slowly, the tension easing just enough. And when he left, the room felt different again, not empty, but quieter in a way that allowed my thoughts to settle without being interrupted. And a few minutes later, there was another knock, softer this time, followed by the woman returning with a tray, and the smell of warm food filled the room in a way that made my stomach react immediately, reminding me how long it had been since I had eaten properly. And she set everything down carefully, explaining what each item was in a calm voice that did not overwhelm. And I thanked her, my voice still quieter than usual, but steadier than before. And when she left, I sat there for a moment just looking at the tray, at the simple act of being given something without having to earn it or justify it. And I picked up the glass of water first, taking a slow sip, feeling it settle in my throat, grounding me again in the present. And then I ate. Slowly at first, then with more certainty as my body remembered what it needed. And with each bite, I felt something else returning, not just strength, but clarity, like the fog that had been sitting over everything was beginning to lift just enough for me to see more clearly. And as I finished, I leaned back slightly, my hand returning to my stomach, feeling the gentle movement there, and I whispered again, softer this time, "We are okay." And it felt different now, less like a question and more like something I was starting to believe. And time passed quietly after that, the kind of quiet that did not press in on you but simply existed. And when the knock came again later, it did not make me freeze the same way. It made me pause, then respond. And the man who entered introduced himself as a doctor, his manner calm, respectful, explaining everything before he did anything, asking permission at every step. And I realized how much that mattered, how each small moment of choice was rebuilding something I had lost without even realizing it. And the check was brief, careful, and when he said everything looked good, that the baby sounded strong, something in my chest loosened in a way I had not expected, like I had been holding on to that worry without fully acknowledging it. And after he left, I sat there again, absorbing it all, the room, the quiet, the fact that I was still here and nothing had gone wrong. And later, when the sun had shifted lower in the sky and the light in the room softened, I heard footsteps outside, slower than before, familiar now in a way that surprised me. And the door opened just slightly before he stepped in again, pausing the same way he had earlier, waiting for that silent permission. And when I met his eyes this time, there was less uncertainty in me, not gone, but reduced, enough to let something else surface, curiosity. And he seemed to notice that too, the faint change in my expression. And he asked if I had eaten, and I nodded, adding a quiet thank you that felt more natural than anything I had said before. And he inclined his head slightly, accepting it without turning it into something larger. And then he said something that made me still for a moment, that there were things we needed to talk about, not urgently, not all at once, but soon, and that he wanted me to be ready when that happened. And I felt a small tension return. Not fear exactly, but awareness, because I knew that whatever came next would require me to face more than just what had already happened. And yet I did not feel alone in that thought, not the way I would have before. And as I looked at him, really looked, I realized that whatever path I had stepped onto the night before, it was not something I could simply walk away from now. And for the first time, that did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like the beginning of something I did not yet understand, but was starting to choose. The way he said it stayed with me long after he left the room. Not the words themselves, but the quiet certainty behind them. Like whatever conversation was coming would not be something I could avoid or delay forever. And I sat there for a while after the door closed, my fingers tracing slow patterns over the fabric of the blanket, my mind moving through possibilities I could not fully form yet, because part of me still wanted to believe that I could stay here without questions, without decisions, just exist in the space he had given me. But another part of me knew that nothing about this was temporary, not really. And eventually I stood, moving slowly across the room, not because I was weak, but because I was aware of every step now, aware of my body in a way I had not been before, and I paused at the mirror near the corner, hesitating for just a second before looking at my reflection, and it felt unfamiliar at first, like I was seeing someone else, someone who looked tired but not defeated, someone who had been through something but had not completely disappeared inside it. And I lifted my hand slightly, brushing a strand of hair back, studying the small details as if they might tell me something I needed to know. And for the first time in a long time, I did not look away immediately. I stayed there, holding my own gaze, letting the moment stretch just enough to feel real. And then I exhaled slowly, stepping back, because I realized that whatever came next would require me to face more than just him. It would require me to face myself too. And the thought was both steadying and unsettling at the same time. And when the knock came again later that evening, it felt different from before, not something that startled me, but something I had been expecting without realizing it. And when I opened the door, he was there, standing with the same composed presence, his expression unchanged, but his eyes slightly sharper, more focused, like this moment mattered in a different way. And he asked if I was ready to talk, not assuming, not pushing, just offering the next step. And I nodded, not because I felt completely prepared, but because I understood that waiting would not change what needed to be said. And he stepped aside slightly, giving me the option to follow or stay, and I chose to follow, my steps measured but steady as I moved into the hallway, the space around me feeling less overwhelming now, more familiar in a way that made it easier to breathe. And we walked in silence for a few moments, not awkward, just quiet, until we reached a room that felt different from the others, more private, more intentional. And he opened the door, letting me enter first, and I noticed how nothing about his actions rushed me, how everything was paced in a way that allowed me to adjust rather than react. And I took a seat where he indicated, a chair positioned near a window that overlooked the city, the lights outside already beginning to glow against the darkening sky. And he sat across from me, not too close, not too far, just enough distance to feel balanced. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us not as pressure but as space. And then he began, his voice calm but more direct now, saying that what happened the night before was not something he had planned, but it was not something he would ignore either. And I listened, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my focus steady on him, because for once I did not feel the need to prepare for what might come next. I simply needed to understand. And he continued, explaining that he knew more about my situation than I might expect, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that suggested he had made the effort to see clearly before acting. And I felt a flicker of something inside me, not fear, but awareness. Because it meant this was not random. This was intentional. And then he said something that made everything else pause, that I had a choice now. And the words felt heavier than anything else he had said so far, because choice was not something I had been given recently, not in a way that mattered. And he did not rush to explain it. He let the weight of it settle first, watching me with that same steady focus. And then he clarified, saying that I could stay here as long as I needed. No conditions attached, or I could leave when I felt ready, with support if I wanted it. And for a moment, I did not know how to respond, not because I did not understand, but because I was not used to being given something without a hidden cost. And I searched his expression for something else, something that would reveal an expectation. But there was nothing there except patience, and I realized that whatever this was, it was real in a way I was still learning to trust. And I took a slow breath, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach again, grounding myself in the one thing that had remained constant through everything. And when I finally spoke, my voice was quiet but clear, asking why, not accusing, not doubting, just needing to understand. And he held my gaze for a moment before answering, not immediately, but with intention, like he was choosing the truth rather than the easiest explanation. And when he did speak, his voice was softer than before, but just as certain. And in that moment, I realized that whatever answer he gave would not just explain his actions, it would define everything that came next. He did not look away when I asked. And that was the first thing I noticed, not the answer itself, but the way he held my gaze, like he understood the weight of the question, like he knew I was not just asking for a reason, but for something I could hold on to, something that would make sense of everything that had shifted so suddenly. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, not rehearsed, saying that some things are easy to ignore until they are not. And I felt my breath pause slightly because it was not the kind of answer I expected. It was not detailed or complicated. It was simple in a way that made it harder to dismiss. And he continued, explaining that he had seen situations like mine before, not identical, but close enough to recognize the pattern. The way control can disguise itself as care. The way silence can become normal when it should not be. And as he spoke, I felt something inside me tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. Because he was describing something I had lived without ever putting it into words. And he was doing it without judgment, without making me feel like I should have known sooner or acted differently. And that made it easier to listen, easier to stay present instead of retreating into myself. And he said that when he saw me in that moment, sitting in the cold, it was not something he could walk past, not because it was his responsibility, but because it became his decision, and I felt that settle into me slowly. The distinction between responsibility and choice, because one implies obligation and the other implies intention, and intention carries weight in a different way. And I found myself watching him more closely now, trying to understand the space between what he said and what he meant, and I realized that nothing about him felt uncertain, not in the way he spoke, not in the way he held himself. Everything was deliberate. And for a moment, I wondered what kind of life shapes a person into that. What kind of experiences lead someone to act without hesitation in a situation that most people would avoid? And he seemed to sense that shift in me again, the curiosity, the quiet questions forming behind my expression, and he did not interrupt it. He let it exist, giving me the space to process without rushing me forward. And then he added something that changed the direction of the moment entirely, saying that what happened next would depend on me, not on him, not on what he could offer or provide, but on what I chose to do with the space I had been given. And I felt that land differently than anything else, because it placed something back in my hands that I had not held in a long time. Control, not in a forceful way, but in a quiet, steady way that required me to engage rather than react. And I looked down at my hands for a second, noticing how still they had become compared to the night before, how the shaking had eased without me realizing it. And I placed one hand over my stomach again, feeling the gentle movement there, a reminder that whatever choice I made would not just affect me. And when I looked back up at him, there was something different in my expression, not certainty, not yet, but intention. And he seemed to recognize that too, his posture relaxing just slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because something had shifted in the way I was approaching it. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence returning, but carrying a different kind of energy now, not uncertainty, but possibility. And I realized that the fear I had been carrying was no longer at the front of everything. It was still there, but it was no longer the only thing guiding me. And that realization felt unfamiliar but steady, like learning how to stand again, after being off balance for too long. And I took a slow breath before speaking, my voice quiet but clearer than before, saying that I did not know what I was supposed to do next, not asking for instruction but acknowledging the truth of it. And he nodded once, not surprised, not concerned, just accepting it as part of the process. And he said that I did not need to have the answer immediately. That understanding comes in steps, not all at once. And there was something about the way he said it that removed the pressure I did not realize I had placed on myself, the need to figure everything out quickly, to justify being here, to make sense of it all in a way that felt complete. And instead he offered something simpler, that I could start by staying, by allowing myself time to adjust, to rest, to think without being pushed, and that anything beyond that could come later. And I felt a quiet sense of relief move through me. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, just steady, like something settling into place where it belonged. And I nodded again, this time with more certainty than before, not because I had all the answers, but because I understood the first step. And as I sat there, the city lights reflecting softly through the window behind him, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to survive the moment. I was beginning to consider what might come after it. Staying sounded simple when he said it. But as I sat there with his words settling into the quiet space between us, I realized it was not just about remaining in this building or sleeping in a safe room. It was about allowing myself to exist without expecting something to go wrong. And that was harder than I wanted to admit, because my mind kept searching for the next moment that would require me to react, the next shift in tone or movement that would signal everything changing again. And when it did not come, when the silence remained steady and unbroken, I found myself unsure of what to do with that stillness. And he must have noticed the way my eyes moved slightly, the way I was listening for something that was not there, because he spoke again, not to interrupt, but to guide, saying that it takes time for the body to understand what the mind is beginning to accept. And I felt that land somewhere deep, because it explained something I had not been able to name. The way my thoughts were starting to settle while my instincts were still catching up, still bracing for something that was no longer present. And I nodded slowly, not because I fully understood it yet, but because I recognized the truth in it. And he stood then, not abruptly, just a natural shift that signaled the conversation was reaching a pause, rather than an end. And he said that I did not need to decide anything else tonight. That rest was enough for now. And as he moved toward the door, I felt a brief hesitation rise in me. Not fear, but something closer to uncertainty, like I was not sure what happened when he was no longer in the room, not because I depended on him, but because his presence had become a point of stability I had not expected. And before I could question it too much, he paused at the doorway, turning slightly, and said that someone would always be nearby if I needed anything, that I would not have to ask twice. And then he left, the door closing quietly behind him, and I sat there for a moment longer, letting everything settle again. And when I finally stood, the room felt different, not just safe, but mine in a way I was still learning to accept. And I walked slowly back to the window, looking out at the city now fully lit, each building holding its own story, its own movement. And I realized that life was continuing everywhere else without pause, without hesitation, while mine had shifted completely in a single night. And yet I did not feel left behind. I felt like I had stepped into something new, something I had not planned but was now part of, and I stayed there for a while, my reflection faint against the glass, my hand resting over my stomach again, grounding myself in the present. And when I finally returned to the bed, the softness no longer felt overwhelming. It felt deserved in a way I had not allowed myself to consider before, and I lay down carefully, adjusting the blanket around me, listening to the quiet not as something empty, but as something steady, something I could trust for now. And my eyes closed more easily this time, my breathing slower, more even. And as sleep began to settle in, I noticed the absence of tension in my shoulders, the way my body was beginning to release something it had been holding on to for too long. And the last thought that crossed my mind before everything faded was not about what I had left behind, but about what he had said, that this was my choice now, and for the first time in a long time. That did not feel like a burden. It felt like something I could grow into, something I could learn to hold without fear. And when I woke again the next morning, the light felt different, not just brighter but clearer, and I sat up slowly, my movements more natural now, less cautious. And I realized that the hesitation that had followed me from the night before had softened, not disappeared completely, but no longer controlling every thought. And as I stood and moved through the room, there was a quiet awareness in me, a sense that I was no longer just reacting to what had happened. I was beginning to respond to what was ahead, and that shift, small as it was, felt like the beginning of something I had not thought possible, something steady, something real, something that might finally belong to me by the third morning. I realized something had changed in a way that felt quieter but more permanent, not in the room around me, but inside me. Like the constant tension I had been carrying had loosened just enough to let something else take its place, something steadier. And I moved through the space without the same hesitation, my steps more certain, my breathing more even. And when I caught my reflection again, it did not feel unfamiliar this time. It felt like I was slowly recognizing myself again, piece by piece, and I rested my hand over my stomach, feeling the gentle movement beneath my palm, and I smiled without thinking, a small, natural reaction that surprised me because it had not come from relief or distraction. It had come from something deeper, something real, and I stayed there for a moment, letting that feeling settle, before turning toward the door when I heard the soft knock that had become familiar. And when I opened it, the woman greeted me with the same calm warmth, offering breakfast and asking if I needed anything else. And I found myself answering more easily now, my voice steadier, my words clearer, not rushed or cautious in the same way. And she nodded as if she had been expecting that shift, as if she had seen it happen many times before. and after she left I sat down again, taking my time with the meal, not because I needed to force myself, but because I was learning how to exist without urgency, how to let moments unfold instead of reacting to them. And as I finished I noticed something else. The quiet was no longer something I listened through. It was something I was part of, something that no longer felt like a space waiting to be filled with something else. And that realization stayed with me as I stood and moved toward the window again. The city below already alive with movement, people walking, cars passing. Everything continuing as it always had. And I wondered briefly what it would feel like to step back into that, not as I was before, but as I was becoming now. And the thought did not feel impossible anymore. It felt distant but reachable, like something I could move toward when I was ready. And as if that thought had reached him somehow, the door opened again later, and Adrian stepped inside with the same measured presence, his expression unchanged, but his eyes observant in that quiet way that missed nothing, and he paused just inside the room, giving me space to acknowledge him before moving further. And when I met his gaze this time, there was no hesitation, only awareness. And he seemed to notice that immediately, a slight shift in his posture that suggested approval without needing to say it. And he asked how I was feeling. The same question as before, but it felt different now, because I had a different answer. And I said better, not perfectly, not completely, but better, and he nodded once, accepting it without probing further. And then he said that there were a few things he needed me to know, not as instructions but as information, and I listened, my attention steady, as he explained that while I was here, everything I needed would be taken care of, that I would not have to worry about practical things like food, medical care, or safety. And the way he said safety made me pause for a second, not because it was new, but because it had become something I was starting to believe rather than just hear. And he continued, explaining that no one from my past would be allowed to reach me here without my consent. And that word again, consent, stood out in a way that grounded everything else he was saying. And I felt something settle more firmly inside me, something that felt like control returning in a way that was not overwhelming but steady. And I nodded slowly, understanding more than just the words, understanding the structure he was creating around me, not as a cage, but as a boundary, something that existed to protect rather than confine. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence returning, but now it felt like a shared space rather than an empty one. And I realized that I was no longer measuring every word, no longer anticipating what might come next with the same tension. I was simply present, and that was something I had not felt in a long time. And as he turned slightly, preparing to leave, he paused again, looking back at me with that same steady gaze. And he said something that stayed with me long after he left, that what I was feeling now was not temporary, that it was something I could build on if I chose to. And as the door closed behind him, I stood there for a moment, letting those words settle, and I realized that for the first time, I was not just recovering from what had happened. I was beginning to understand what it meant to move forward. It did not happen all at once. The shift he spoke about, it came in small moments that I almost missed if I was not paying attention, like the way I no longer hesitated before opening the door when someone knocked, or how I stopped bracing myself when footsteps passed outside my room. And by the fourth day, I realized I was no longer counting time in minutes or waiting for something to interrupt it. I was simply moving through it. And that felt unfamiliar in a way that was both steady and fragile, like something new that needed to be handled carefully. And I found myself exploring more of the space beyond my room, not wandering aimlessly but walking with quiet intention, learning the layout, the rhythm of the place, the way people moved with purpose but without tension. And no one questioned me. No one stopped me. They acknowledged me with small nods, respectful, measured, like they understood I was still finding my place in all of this. And that understanding made it easier to continue, easier to step forward without feeling like I was intruding. And when I reached the main area again, the same open space where I had first arrived, I paused, taking in the details I had not fully noticed before, the way everything was organized, the balance between openness and control. And I realized that nothing here was accidental. Everything had been designed to function in a certain way. And that realization made me think of him, of Adrian, because the space reflected the same presence he carried, calm, deliberate, structured without being restrictive. And I wondered again about the life he lived outside of these moments, about the decisions he made that led him to where he was now. And before I could follow that thought too far, I heard his voice behind me, not close, not sudden, just there, saying my name in that same steady tone, and I turned without hesitation this time, meeting his gaze with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and he studied me for a second, not in a way that felt like judgment, but in a way that suggested he was noticing the changes I was only beginning to understand myself, and he nodded slightly, as if confirming something, and then he asked if I had been resting well, and I answered honestly, saying that I had, that it was easier now, and he accepted that without comment, just a brief acknowledgement that felt like recognition rather than approval. And then he said something that shifted the moment in a different direction, that there was something I needed to see, not urgently, but soon, and I felt a small tension return, not fear, but anticipation, because I understood that this was part of what he had mentioned before, the things we would need to address. And I asked what it was, my voice steady but quieter than usual, and he did not answer immediately, not because he was avoiding it, but because he seemed to be choosing how to present it in a way that would not overwhelm me. And then he said that it was about my past, about what I had left behind, and I felt my breath slow slightly, my hand instinctively moving to my stomach again, grounding myself in the present, and he noticed that. Of course he did, but he did not comment on it. He simply waited, giving me space to process the words before continuing, and then he explained that there had been attempts to reach me, not directly, not in a way that had succeeded, but enough to make it clear that what I had stepped away from was not finished with me, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not panic, but awareness, because I had known, somewhere deep down, that leaving would not erase everything immediately, that there would be consequences, echoes of what had been. And he saw that realization settle in me, saw the way my posture shifted slightly, and he spoke again, his tone calm but firm, saying that I did not need to handle any of that on my own, that nothing would be allowed to reach me here without my decision and the way. He said decision mattered again, grounding everything in that same principle he had introduced from the beginning, that I had a choice in how things moved forward, and I nodded slowly, not because I had an answer yet, but because I understood the structure he was offering, the protection that did not remove my control, and for a moment we stood there in silence, the space between us steady, not empty, and I realized that this was the next step, not a return to what had been, but a movement through it, a way of facing it without being pulled back into it. And as I looked at him, at the calm certainty in his expression, I felt something shift again, deeper this time, not just trust, but alignment, like I was beginning to understand not just what he was doing, but why. And that understanding made the uncertainty ahead feel less overwhelming, not because it was gone, but because I was no longer facing it alone. And when he finally gestured for me to follow, I did not hesitate, not this time, because I knew that whatever I was about to see, whatever came next, it was part of the path I had already started to choose. We walked in silence, not the kind that leaves you searching for something to say, but the kind that gives space for what is coming. And I followed a step behind him, my pace steady, my breathing even, my hand resting lightly over my stomach as if reminding myself that I was grounded, that I was here by choice. And the hallway we moved through felt different from the rest of the building, quieter, more contained, like it held things that mattered in a different way. And when he stopped in front of a door, he did not open it immediately. He turned slightly toward me, giving me a moment, not to prepare, but to decide if I was ready to see whatever was on the other side. And I realized then that this was not about revealing something to me. It was about allowing me to face it on my own terms. And I nodded once, a small movement, but enough. And he opened the door, stepping aside so I could enter first. And the room inside was not what I expected. There was no tension in it, no confrontation waiting. Just a quiet space with a table, a chair, and a folder resting neatly in the center. And I moved closer slowly, my eyes fixed on that single object because I understood without being told that it held something important, something connected to the life I had stepped away from. And I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the folder before I paused, feeling a brief hesitation, not fear, but awareness of what opening it would mean. And I took a breath, steady, deliberate, before lifting the cover, and inside were documents, simple, clear, organized in a way that made them easy to follow. And as I looked through them, I realized they were not just records, they were proof, a reflection of everything that had been happening around me in ways I had not fully seen, patterns, details, timelines that showed the structure behind what I had once thought was normal, and I felt something shift inside me, not shock, not even surprise, but clarity, the kind that settles in slowly and leaves no room for denial. And I heard his voice behind me, calm as always, explaining that this was not meant to overwhelm me, but to give me a clear view, to remove any uncertainty about what I had experienced. And I nodded slightly, not looking back at him yet, because I needed to process what was in front of me, needed to let it settle without distraction. And as I closed the folder gently, my hand resting on top of it for a moment, I realized that I was not the same person who had sat in that shed, not because everything had changed, but because I had. And when I finally turned to face him, there was something different in the way I held his gaze, not just awareness, but decision, and he saw it immediately. The shift, the clarity that had replaced hesitation, and he did not ask what I was thinking. He did not need to, because whatever I had found in those pages had already answered something inside me. And I spoke quietly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, saying that I understood now, not just what had happened, but why I could not go back. And he nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for, not to influence, but to confirm that I had reached it on my own. And for a second the room felt completely still, like everything had aligned into a single point of clarity. And then he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. That understanding is not the end. It is the beginning of what you choose to do next. And I felt that settle into me deeply, not as pressure, but as direction. Because for the first time, the future did not feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I could shape, and I placed my hand over my stomach again, feeling the steady presence beneath my palm, and I realized that this was not just about me anymore. It was about the life I was responsible for, the life that deserved something different, something better. And when I looked back at him, there was no hesitation left, only certainty, and I said that I was staying, not as a question, not as a temporary decision, but as something I had chosen fully. And he held my gaze for a moment before responding, his voice quiet but firm.